everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I am super excited to share with all of you a big eyeshadow ranking video. So this is my first video of 2023. Happy New Year to all of you. I hope you all had a wonderful holiday season. So for this first video, I thought it would be fun to dig into my favorite makeup product, which is eyeshadow palettes, and share with you guys a ranking of all of the palettes I tried in the past year. I have a lot of really amazing palettes in this video, so if you're interested in learning more about my eyeshadow collection, then just stick around. So first off, let me just preface this by saying that I don't think there's any duds in my ranking. So these are all palettes I bought for myself and did due diligence on before I purchased, and so there's really no palette in this lineup that I wouldn't recommend. These are all pretty amazing palettes. And so if you see some of your favorites ranked pretty low, that doesn't mean that I don't think it's an amazing palette. It just so happens that I really lucked out in the past year and only picked up palettes that are really high quality. So with that disclaimer out of the way, unfortunately there is always a last place, and here we have the Natasha Denona Jubilee palette. So this is a palette that I got in an Gypsy Glam bag. So there's really nothing wrong with this palette. It's in Natasha Denona's amazing formulations. It just so happens that this isn't really a color story that I gravitate to a lot. So I've done a few looks using this palette where I've used these mattes to kind of set up the look, deepened it with this teal shade, and then gone in with this shimmer all over the lid, and then a little bit of this in the inner corner. And so that's kind of my go-to look with this, and other than that look, I don't really find myself reaching for this. But it is a really unique palette, and so if you can pick this up from Ipsy, BoxyCharm, one of those places, I think it's a pretty good deal. In second to last place, we have the Natasha Denona Baby Retro palette. So similar to the previous one, there's really nothing particularly wrong with this palette. I actually really love the midi size of the Natasha Denona Retro, and these three shades are from that midi size palette. It just so happens that compared to all of the other palettes I tried out in the past year, this one's just not particularly special. With these three shades, you can get a very simple, beautiful, rosy look. You don't get a lot of depth because this is more of a mid-tone shade, but I do really love this shade here, Jude. It's one of my favorite shades. Also, when I first picked this up in my initial video, I did do some swatch comparisons between this and the same shades in the midi size, and I did notice a little bit of a quality difference. So even though this is also made in Italy, similar to the full size, it's a little bit less creamy in comparison to her normal shadows. And so that's the only thing that I didn't really like about this, but I love all of these shades. I love the midi size, so overall not a bad palette. Next up, we have this palette from Suqqu. This is in the limited edition color story Yoiyukari. And I would say already at this point in the video, we're talking about palettes that I do really like and enjoy. It's just that I didn't like them as much as other palettes. And so this palette was my first time trying a Suqqu palette, and it is a really lovely quality palette if you want that sort of very sheer eyeshadow look. None of these shades are that pigmented, even though they might look very pigmented in pan. When you actually get them on the lids, it's a much more soft, subtle look. And so I think if you're interested in that sort of effect, Suqqu is a really great brand to look into. For me, it's just that this particular color story with that very satin effect was not necessarily my favorite. So I do like the look that I get out of this, but I find that I really have to build up the pigment a lot in order to be able to see either of these two top shades. The bottom two show up decently well, but the top two are just a little bit too sheer for my taste. Also, I feel like this color story can either be really beautiful, ethereal, and fairy-like, or it can kind of look like a bruise. And in my video where I showcased this palette, some of you did comment that, and after that, I couldn't really unsee that. And so I think that this palette is not necessarily the best representation of a Suqqu palette, in that most of their palettes are much more neutral. And I think for those sorts of color stories, the sheer effect works a lot better. So on the whole, even though I like this palette, I'm glad I picked it up. It didn't really blow me away, and the color story is just not my favorite. Next up, we have the first Tom Ford palette in this lineup. This is Pretty Baby. So earlier this year, I picked up 3 Tom Ford quads from the cosmetic company store. I got these for like $20, so very, very discounted. That said, for my rankings today, I'm still trying to keep in mind that it's probably hard for most of you to pick this up for $20. So I'm thinking of this more as a $45 to $90 palette, since this retails for $90 and you can typically get it for around 50% off at a lot of retailers. So with Pretty Baby, there's really nothing wrong with this palette. It's just a color story I don't gravitate to a lot. Unlike the other 2 Tom Ford palettes I'll talk about today, this is in a pressed pigment formula instead of his baked gelée formula. And I do prefer that baked gelée formula, so those palettes are ranking a little bit higher. What does make this palette special though is this dual chrome shade here. So it's not that common for Tom Ford to do dual chromes. And so that's why I picked this up. And I do think this shade in particular is really lovely on the lids. I would say these other shades are just okay. They're nothing particularly special or anything to write home about. And so for me, this palette is really about this shade, and that's why it's kind of ranking a little bit lower on the list. But if you can get this for a steeply discounted price, I would still recommend this palette. Next up, we have another Tom Ford palette. This is Body Heat. So this is in his Baked Gelée formula, so I do really love this formulation. In case you guys aren't familiar with this formula, these are all shimmer shades, but they kind of vary in the intensity of the shimmer. So these bottom ones over here are a little bit more of a satin shimmer and are very flattering on textured lids. And then you have some more shimmery shades like this that are a bit more metallic. And so this palette is really beautiful for just a very neutral look. Overall, this seems to be a pretty popular color story for Tom Ford because he keeps re-releasing Body Heat in new packaging every year. So I was excited to add this to my collection. I will say though, this is not a color story I find particularly exciting, which is why it's ranking a bit lower on the list. I think if you're someone who's a real neutral lover, then this is a beautiful palette, especially if you can get it at a discount. The only thing I'm not a huge fan of with this palette is these 2 shades on the bottom are very similar. And considering this normally retails for $90, you don't want 2 of the shades to kind of look the same on the lids. And then for me personally, this sort of reddish brown shade is not something I gravitate to a lot in my eyeshadow looks. So on the whole, really beautiful formula. The quality is impeccable. It's just the color story that doesn't do it for me. Moving right along, this might come as a surprise to many of you, but I have here the Lisa Eldridge Myth palette. This is the newest eyeshadow palette to my collection and one that I was extremely excited about. But unfortunately, from a quality perspective, it hasn't necessarily been my favorite. So it's ranking higher than the Tom Ford palettes and the Suqqu palette simply because I really like this color story and also love this packaging. I mean, this is maybe like one of my top favorites in terms of packaging. But in terms of formulation, it wasn't really something I enjoyed that much. So this Velvet Matte formula, which really predominates this palette, so you have 4 velvet mattes, is very similar to Natasha Denona's cream to powder formula. And as you guys might know, that formula is quite controversial. Some people love it, some people hate it. To me, this is kind of similar to one of the original cream to powder formulations from Natasha, sort of around the time her Metropolis palette came out. I feel like since then she has improved that formulation, and so I'm not a huge fan of how this is a little bit more like the OG formulation. It sometimes balls up a bit. It doesn't necessarily always apply smoothly to the lids. Sometimes I find it skips. I also do find I have to build it up a lot to get the opacity that I want. So if you are someone who prefers more sheer eyeshadows, I think this formula works quite well, but just for my makeup tastes, I'm not a huge fan of it. Also in this palette, there's really only one all over the lid shimmer shade, which is this one over here, and that's Faded Amethyst. So this is a gorgeous shade, but because it's the only all over the lid shade, unless you're doing an all matte look, it does limit the versatility of this palette. For me personally, I don't really like all matte looks that much, and as I just mentioned, this is not my favorite matte formula anyway. And so I find every time I use this palette, I'm mainly relying on this metallic shade. And so all of the looks look kind of similar and also look a lot darker than I typically would like because this is a pretty dark metallic. Finally, I'm just not a huge fan, unfortunately, of this Illusionism top coat shade. It's very, very subtle. So if you're someone who doesn't really like much glimmer on the eye, then I think you might like this. But I find for me to even be able to really see it, I have to put several layers on. And as I'm building up those layers, I find that my finger starts removing the eyeshadow beneath. And so on the whole, I would say this is a nice palette for someone who really wants a subtle purple look, but it's not really one that I would recommend if you're like myself and prefer more pigmented eyeshadow looks. Moving right along, the next palette I have is the Viseart Cashmere palette. So this is a lovely palette if you want a cool toned neutral look. This kind of has everything you need to achieve a variety of different looks in that category. Also, the Viseart formula is impeccable, so I really do enjoy this palette. It's just one that I frankly don't reach for that often. I feel like there's a lot of palettes recently that have had this sort of color story. So Moonlit Seduction, Natasha Denona's Retro palette, Natasha Denona's Glam palette. And so there's a lot of competition for this kind of category. And for me personally, even though I've gotten more interested in cool tone neutrals recently, it's still just not a color story I gravitate to very often. And so I find even though this is a really awesome palette, beautiful quality, beautiful color story, I almost never reach for this, and it's just less exciting to me than my other palettes. And so this is why it's ranking where it is. The next palette we have is this little one from Dear Dahlia. So this is the color story Romantic Bloom, and this was kind of a surprise for me because I didn't think I would like this palette that much. As you can see, it's a very small palette. You just get 3 shades, so 2 very light matte shades, and then this beautiful shimmer. But for me, the shimmer is really the star of the show. It's incredibly, incredibly gorgeous on the lid. Let me actually give you guys a swatch of this. So as you can see, it's really nice and shimmery. It has that beautiful wet look to it. And in person, you can actually see that there's a lot of different colors of shimmer in this. You have some silver, some gold, some copper. And so it's actually very multi-dimensional, even though from a distance, it might just look like a very simple bronzy shade. So even though this palette is kind of boring overall and not really my typical cup of tea, I do find myself reaching for this when I want a very simple, very subtle look. This is really perfect for that. You really don't have to think about it. And it's also just very nicely compact, so it's perfect for traveling. Next up, we have Ritualistic Rose from Pat McGrath. And I'm just realizing I misspoke earlier. The Lisa Eldridge one is not the most recent palette in my collection. I picked this one up after that one. And so this one is ranking where it is because on the one hand, I absolutely love this formulation. Pat McGrath's Blitz Astral formulas are some of my favorite on the market. But on the other hand, this color story is a little bit limiting to me. So it doesn't really carry that much depth. If you guys watched my video showcasing this palette, I think that look is probably the one look that I would get by using this palette by itself. I haven't yet gotten a chance to play around with this palette paired with other palettes, but I am excited to try that to have some more versatile looks. On its own though, it's just a very pretty palette, but one that I wouldn't necessarily gravitate to by itself. In addition, I will say that the shadows are a bit chunky and flaky, in particular these 2 shadows over here, which are the most beautiful shadows in the palette. But I would recommend going in with either a very tacky primer or some mixing liquid if you're going into either of these shades. These other 2 shades are much more satin metallic, so they blend very easily on the lids. You can even use them in lieu of mattes, but these 2 can just be a little bit chunky and give you fallout, and so that's the one thing I'm not a huge fan of with this palette, but overall it's really beautiful and I think nice to round out a Pat McGrath collection. Next up, we have Pillow Talk Dreams from Charlotte Tilbury. So this is my favorite eyeshadow palette from Charlotte, and so even though it's not ranking super high up on this list, I would highly recommend this if you are interested in checking out Charlotte Tilbury eyeshadows and you have similar taste in eyeshadow to me. So this is way, way, way better than the original Pillow Talk in my book. So if you guys watched my original Pillow Talk video, for the Pillow Talk quad, I find that it translates very orangey on my lids. And so it really doesn't give me that nice neutral, subtle look. This is much more pigmented, so it's not necessarily subtle, but the undertones are much more flattering on my skin tone, and so I've really enjoyed wearing this on days when I want a very sultry glam look. These two mattes here are extremely pigmented and buttery. They blend out beautifully and build up beautifully on the lids. And then these two shimmers over here are both really gorgeous as well. They're a bit more high impact than some of her other shimmers, so definitely more high impact than the ones in Pillow Talk, but they still have a nice creaminess to them, so when I use this palette, I never get any fallout. So on the whole, a really solid release from Charlotte. I hope she comes out with some more eyeshadows that might be a little bit more up my alley, but this is a great palette to pick up if you really want that kind of Charlotte Tilbury soft glam effect. Next up, we have our first larger palette. So this is the Natasha Denona Pastel palette. This was one of the most unique releases of 2022, so I was very excited to pick this up. I don't really have many pastel eyeshadows in my collection, so I was really excited how this dramatically increased the pastel offerings. You can see this whole palette is very pastel, and so you won't get much depth out of this, but if you want a really beautiful spring or summer look that's very colorful, this is a great palette to check out. It's a little bit daunting to make a look when you first look at this palette because it just looks so colorful and chaotic. But when I did my dedicated video to this, I swatched all the shades in order, and there actually are a lot of pinky purple shades in this palette. So if you're someone who finds that pink and purple is more of your comfort zone, this might not actually be as difficult to create looks around as you might think. Basically around half of the palette, so these two shades, these two, this one, and this one are all in that pinky purple family. And then you have this little green family, and then this little blue family, and then these two warm shades. And so if you break the palette down in that way, you can actually create really beautiful gradients, and it doesn't necessarily have to be super in-your-face color. The quality in this palette is also really nice for pastel shades. So in general, pastel mattes are pretty hard to formulate, and so they tend to be on the drier side and a little bit more chalky. This one is no exception in that it does have a little bit more dryness and chalkiness than your typical Natasha Denona formula, but it's still way better than most of the other pastel shadows on the market. And so if you're interested in color, I would highly recommend checking out this palette. It's a lot of fun and definitely pushes you out of your comfort zone. The next palette is this beauty from Adept Cosmetics. This is the Ninhydrin palette. So I was super excited to check out this palette because Adept Cosmetics has been a brand that has interested me for quite a while, and I was really excited to finally try out their shadows. I think their metallics and dual chromes in this palette are absolutely gorgeous. I mean, let me just actually give you guys a swatch. Like, look how high shine that is and just how creamy that is. It just swatches like a dream. All of these shades are really, really beautiful and apply super easily to the lids. I've really enjoyed creating colorful looks from this palette. It has a lot of my favorite blue purple shades, but also has beautiful shades in the gold, green, pink category as well. So overall, a very nice, well-rounded palette if you're interested in high shine or multi-chrome shades. I think Adept Cosmetics is also really great to check out if you're someone who's interested in indie formulations, but is a bit intimidated by not having a color curation. You'll see more of my indie shadow collection in the rest of this video, but I do really like how with this palette you have all of the shades together in a curated color story. Yes, it is a very colorful color story, but they are selected to all look very beautiful together. Now, the only thing I'm not a huge fan of with this palette, which is why it's ranking a bit lower than my other indie shadows, is that I really don't like these two matte shades very much. I don't know if it's just these two particular mattes or just Adept Cosmetics' matte formula in general, but I found these two to be a little bit patchy, not that easy to apply. And so as a result, usually when I use this palette, I actually go in with some Natasha Denona shadows for the mattes, and then I'll just choose among the shimmers in this palette. And so from that standpoint, it's just a little bit less cohesive for me because I don't use this for a full look, but it's still a beautiful palette with a ton of gorgeous shades to select from. Next up, we have the custom palette I built from Addiction Tokyo. So I still haven't put these into the case, so that's why they're kind of loose here. I'll show you them individually. So here we have Tiny Shell, which is a peachy shimmer shade. Then we have Shanghai Breakfast, which is more of a purpley brown shade. And then we have Gypsy Queen, which is a deeper shimmer shade. And then finally we have Mariage, which is a gorgeous lid topper. So this color story is definitely on the neutral side. It's not as exciting as the Pastel or Ninhydrin palettes I just talked about, but it is really beautiful on the lids. So I really love how Addiction's pearl shimmer shades just look so beautiful and so flattering on the lids. Let me try to actually show you guys in swatch. It's always a little bit hard to pick these things up, but it's just so creamy and buttery on the lids. You can use these kind of like matte shades or as shimmer shades, but they're just very flattering. And then in addition, I was super excited about this flaky shade, which reminds me a lot of Pat McGrath Blitz Astral shades. So it has a beautiful glitter topper effect with a high shine finish. If you've ever wished that you could buy Pat McGrath Blitz Astrals in singles, then Addiction is a really great brand to check out because they have a bunch of different shades in this high shine flaky formula. And even though it's a very pricey brand, it's still a lot cheaper to pick up a couple of these rather than an entire Pat McGrath Mothership palette. So on the whole, I've really been enjoying this quad. I really enjoy the everyday but still sparkly look that it provides. And also, I just think the overall experience that you have at Addiction, selecting each shade individually, is very unique and a lot of fun. So I would highly recommend checking out Addiction if you haven't already. I think you can buy them on YesStyle. And if you ever see them in store, it's a really fun experience to put together your own bespoke palette in person. The next palette is from Dior. This is their Soft Cashmere palette. And this is actually my first and only Dior palette. I'm usually not that interested in their releases because I feel like they get very mixed reviews. But this is the one palette that I heard amazing reviews about very consistently. And so I finally picked it up this year and I can definitely understand all the hype. So this is just a very gorgeous palette with a very simple everyday color story, but with an impeccable formula. So this matte shade over here, even though it's really dark, blends out like a dream. It's such a beautiful silky matte. And then you have the satin shade here, which can be used as a matte or as a shimmer. This shade over here has a bit more high impact and is gorgeous all over the lids. This middle shade is also kind of that satin shimmer effect. And then you have this pretty glitter topper as well. So you can get a really beautiful look out of this with some slight variations. It's kind of a no-brainer palette. Like any of these shadows that you put together will just look really elegant and chic on the lids. And for me, it's really the quality that puts this palette where it is in the ranking. I do prefer this to the Body Heat palette in Tom Ford, even though the color story is slightly similar. And so if you are someone who really likes cool tone neutrals, I would highly recommend checking out this palette. So the next palette is from Tom Ford. This is the Daydream palette. So this is my current favorite Tom Ford palette in my collection. It's just such a beautifully unique color story. It's very rare to see brands do this sort of blue, purple color story in such cool tones. Usually you see them go more for the kind of warm browns, kind of like what we saw with the Addiction shades. And so I was really excited to see this palette, and I was a little bit worried that the quality might not be that good because it's been on sale for a long time, and these sorts of shades in general are typically very hard to formulate. But as you can see, the quality is actually really, really nice on this palette. This does give you a more subtle look than some of the other palettes that I've talked about, but I actually really, really love the look that this palette gives you. This to me is kind of a better version of that Suqqu palette that I showed you guys earlier. They have somewhat similar color stories, but I find the Tom Ford is just much more beautiful and ethereal on the lids and doesn't have that problem of sort of looking like a bruise. Even though these shadows are a bit sheer when you first apply them, you can definitely build them up to full opacity, and they just have such a beautiful, elegant finish to the lids. So every time I use this palette, I'm a huge, huge fan of the looks that I get, and this is in that beautiful wet dry baked gelée formula from Tom Ford, and so you get the full luxury experience as well. Alrighty, so we're getting to the final few eyeshadows now. So next up we have the Natasha Denona Retro Glam Palette. So this to me was a very highly anticipated release in that I've always been interested in her mini retro palette and always thought that the midi retro didn't quite match up. But I was quite surprised that she released this when she did in the winter time as a holiday release. I mean, it does have that sort of red-green Christmas effect, but on the whole, I think of this as more of a spring palette. That said, I've been really enjoying the sage shades in this palette. So every time I look at this palette, that's really what I gravitate towards. You could honestly take away the pink, red, and khaki shades and I would still really love this palette. I find the sage shades just to be so unique and they kind of have that neutral effect but also that colorful effect on the lids, and so I think it's a really great way to incorporate color into your eyeshadow if you're someone who doesn't really want something that stands out too much. I especially really love the shade Marlin. It's just so much fun. When it comes to things outside of makeup, I always love going for the mint or the sage shades. And so this really is that kind of color story that I really enjoy. I will say the one thing I'm not a huge fan of with this palette is it is a little bit hard to make use of the full color story. So in one of my recent videos, I went in with this holly shade all over the crease area and then went in with the sage shades, and I liked that look, but honestly the holly shade wasn't really adding that much. And so I do find that when I try to kind of make this whole color story work, it does get a little bit chaotic. But if you are someone who really likes sage and green shades, then I would highly recommend this palette. And in case you're curious what I have on my eyes today, I did use the sage shade in the crease area, so that's my transition shade. So the next eyeshadows in this ranking are my indie shadows from Clionadh and Terra Moons. So let's first talk about Clionadh. These are their stained glass shades down here. They are incredibly beautiful. It's really hard to capture on camera just how gorgeous these are. Let me actually swatch some of these for you guys. But Clionadh is one of the best brands to check out if you like really shimmery, multi-chromatic shades. This one over here is Opulent. As you can see, there's just so much dimension in that one shadow. It's just so much fun. It looks totally different from different angles. Let me also just swatch Grisel. You can see these two shades are super, super shifty and beautiful. So if you're someone who likes a lot of shine or likes multi-chromes, I would definitely steer you in the direction of Terra Moons or Clionadh. These are some of the best that you can get on the market. They are quite pricey. Each shadow is around $20 for Clionadh and around $15 to $20 for Terra Moons. But I do love every single shadow that I've tried from them. It's just so much fun to play around with their formulations. And if I had to pick one eyeshadow as the winner out of my entire collection, it would definitely be the one that I have on my lids today, which is the Cosmos from Terra Moons. So let me swatch this for you guys. This is my favorite eyeshadow of the year. As you can see, it is so multi-dimensional. Like there's just so many different colors in this, and it's really high shine and reflective as well. It's just so much fun. Like every angle I put my eyes at looks a little bit different. It's the only shimmer that I have on my lids today, even though my lids look super colorful. And I do also enjoy all these other Terra Moon shadows as well. So definitely would recommend these brands. In terms of comparing the two, on the whole, I would say that if you're starting out, I would recommend first trying Terra Moons because they're a little bit more affordable and they have a really wide variety of finishes. They even have matte shadows. So these are two pastel mattes that I picked up from them before the Natasha Denona Pastel palette came out. Definitely though, for both of these brands, where they shine is more with the glittery multi-chrome shades. For Terra Moons, they have extreme multi-chromes and cosmic chameleons, which are really gorgeous. And then for Clionadh, it's the stained glass shades that I would highly recommend. For me, my favorites overall are the Terra Moons ones that have the large mica size and the shifts, which are similar to the Cosmos. I find that some of the Clionadh ones are just a little bit more subtle than the Terra Moons ones. I mean, but still super, super beautiful, as you can see. So I know it's been a little while since I've taken these out and shown you guys these shadows on camera, but they are absolutely gorgeous. And whenever I'm not filming, I love going in with these shadows and just some colorful mattes from Natasha Denona or Pat McGrath. So speaking of colorful mattes, number 3 in this lineup is my Pat McGrath Celestial Nirvana palette. So for today's look, after I went in with that sage shade, I deepened it up with this teal shade and then also added some of this navy shade. So that's basically all of the crease colors, and then I just put the Cosmos over everything. On the lower lash line, I put this teal shade and then this navy shade, and then I went in with some of this baby blue shimmer and some of this lavender shimmer. And that's just because the Cosmos is quite flaky, so I wasn't sure how well it would sit on the lower lash line, but these sort of metallic shades blend beautifully on the lower lash line. So I've been a huge fan of this palette. I was super excited when it came out because up until this palette, whenever I wanted to do a look like today's look, which is really colorful and shimmery, I would have to rely on matte shades from my Natasha Denona collection. And don't get me wrong, I love my Natasha Denona mattes, so no complaining there. But my favorite formulas are still from Pat McGrath, and up until this palette, she never gave us any colorful mattes. And so I was super excited when this came out, and I've been really enjoying it ever since then. It's just such a versatile palette, so it's one that I often bring with me when I'm traveling. If you want just a very basic neutral look, you have that over here. And these 4 are actually some of my favorite neutral shadows from Pat McGrath, because usually she tends to veer more in either the peachy or rosy territory, whereas these are true just neutral brown shades. And so I've actually really been enjoying this quad. And then of course the rest of the palette is just really fun to play around with. Kind of regardless of what kind of look you're going for, you can probably make something similar with this palette in terms of all the different color combinations. Of course, if you're not a big fan of color, I would not recommend this palette. But if you're someone who likes to play around and enjoys Pat McGrath's formula, then this is a really fun palette. So number 2 in my eyeshadow rankings is this Natasha Denona Glam Face Palette. So this one might be a surprise to those of you who didn't watch my Best of 22 makeup video, because this is probably the least interesting palette of this whole set. But for me, this is the palette that I use the most of in 2022. Almost every time I traveled, I brought this palette with me. It's just incredibly versatile. If you want a very basic neutral look, this has you covered. I love these 3 matte shades. They're just very flattering on my skin tone. And then if you want a really soft shimmer on the lid, this highlight is perfect for that. Whereas if you want something that's more high impact, these 2 shimmers are really beautiful. And so this palette truly transitions wonderfully from day to night. And for me, it's just kind of the perfect neutral palette. This is basically how I wish Pillow Talk looked. So if you're someone who has always admired that kind of neutral Pillow Talk effect, but found that Pillow Talk the Quad did not work for you, then this is a really beautiful palette in an impeccable formula that I think you'll get a lot of use from. Finally, we have the palette that beat them all out, which is the Moonlit Seduction palette from Pat McGrath. So this beauty is perfect if you like cool tone neutrals with a slight rosy edge. For me, I find this is the perfect palette whenever I want more of a dark, sultry look. Basically, this shadow here does a great job of deepening up any look, and then these shimmers here are all really beautifully reflective. This one in particular is my overall favorite. It's a really fun dual chrome that reminds me a lot of the Terra Moons and Clionadh shades that I have, but of course in this gorgeous Pat McGrath palette. Even the shimmers that are not the Blitz Astrals are really high shine and reflective, super, super creamy. And so I find this to be just a really fun palette to play around with. The overall look that you'll get from this is going to be a little bit more on the neutral side compared to a lot of her palettes. But as you can tell, the shine that you get from these shades is just so gorgeous. And if you're someone who really likes Divine Rose 1 or Subliminal, I think this palette will be up your alley, just kind of a more amped up version of those in terms of the amount of shine. But it still has that sort of neutral effect, still leans cool on the whole. And of course, you just can't beat the whole Pat McGrath Mothership experience in terms of this really heavy black lacquer packaging with this beautiful gold plating on the back. So that's why this guy got #1 out of all of these amazing palettes. But as I discussed today, really it kind of depends on what your personal preferences are in terms of which of these palettes will work best for you. So I hope you found this video helpful in terms of comparing some of these palettes and just summarizing now, kind of months after I tried most of these palettes, what I like or dislike about them. I would love to hear in the comments below what your favorite palettes were from 2022, and is there anything in particular you're really hoping to see from makeup brands in 2023? For me, as much as I've really been loving all of the cool tone neutrals that we've been seeing, I'm really curious to see if some brands will start to bring warm tones back, because we've had a few seasons now that have been really focused on cool tones. So in general, I've been really enjoying green eyeshadow lately, and so I hope more brands will pick that up and try to incorporate that in some of their color stories. So that's it for today's video. If you guys like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you all so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!